Hello. I just realized that thank you for pointing that out. I didn't realize that I didn't realize that I wasn't on YouTube. I keep forgetting. It's been a minute. So sorry YouTube. Hello. I just realized I wasn't actually streaming on YouTube. I was just sitting in the waiting. But it's helpfully pointed out. For the YouTube, what you missed is basically I'm just kind of recapped what's been going on a little bit, talking about the Supreme Court ruling that came down today regarding workplace discrimination protections for LGBT individuals, and how it's possible that it might be expanded on in sort of the court system, and how maybe it has something to do with um, it may be able to be applied in cases fighting the Trump administration's rollbacks of uh, discrimination for, was it ADA? I mean, or ACA benefits or treatment. I don't know at what point what the specific protections are, and at what point they I guess affect the individual. Like, is it at the point of service or something like that? It's like if you go into the hospital, can they just kick you out or something like that? I mean, I would hope that, or I mean, I guess historically, it hasn't always been the case that medical professionals will take it upon themselves, whatever their own personal beliefs are, to ensure the best care of every individual that comes before them. I think we have different statistics that show that different communities are treated differently, um, even to this day. Uh, but I guess at this point, just be somewhat hopeful that this is at least some level of legal ammunition, some sort of precedent to respond to that rollback, and of course push beyond and guarantee further protections for these marginalized groups. But of course, there's a whole hell of a lot of other things going on. I have, I mean, at least on YouTube, the title of the stream is "Questions in the Cool Zone" because the sort of rate, at least in terms of like the I don't know, zeitgeist, or what the collective conversation. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of discussion and back and forth and hand wringing and virtue signaling and kneeling while wearing freaking African colors and not doing anything. Um, I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone saw the thing the Democrats did that was in the thumbnail for the stream. The Pelosi and Democrats kneeling while wearing the kente cloth. Um, Totally symbolic and completely just void of any like substance. Totally insulting, uh, really infuriating, and frustrating. But there's been a lot of other stuff. I mean, this is like developing as I speak, as any of us, live and breathe. This is an ongoing thing. Me right now, I have a little Word document of like literally like 20 questions. I don't necessarily have answers. I'm not expert or an intellectual or really an organizer or I'm on the ground activist or anything like that. I have my small contribution to this moment, and I have my own relationship with some of the things that are going on right now in this sort of like historic moment of these protests, um, sort of centered around the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, and of course the string of police violence we've seen this since then, including others who've died recently, and I mean, it's a very expansive I think it's way more expansive than anyone could have anticipated. Um, I mean, certainly, I've had discussions and I've absorbed the different kinds of analysis just as much as I can, I guess, about this situation, and of course, like things preceding it. I mean, it's always been the complaint, I guess, that as Americans, it's not really in our culture to really have this sort of prolonged out on the streets civil unrest kind of thing. Like, there's that kind of culture in, say, like a France, or like in, as we've seen in Hong Kong in the past few years. But for us, I remember when Trump first swore in, and we had the women's marches that were massive but totally aimless and amorphous, and just a mess of contradictions, not really asking for anything other than they don't like Trump. A lot of people don't like him, but that's not really a substantive what do you call it? It's not a substantive answer to whatever it is you don't like about him, just to say that you don't like him. Um, and beyond that, we just don't have the level of longevity and the sort of sustained action that really puts a wrench in the gears of our economic system, which is what is necessary for lawmakers and other individuals who have institutional power and institutional positions to take notice to what people are actually talking about. Until this moment, essentially, where this is, my joke is sort of like the not the inflation but the deflation of our attention span, like nationally. Like, if you go back to like 1980 or even 1990 or whatever, 2000, something that held national attention for like 3 months, the equivalent is to like one day on Twitter in America. So to have something go on for like 2 weeks, that's like something that you can have a conversation about for like years, and people online will complain about, well, they're not talking about this, they're not talking about that. I can't really speak on that. I don't have the Twitter analytics or anything like that. I can't look at the numbers and tell anybody what that is, and I don't think any of the people making these claims can either. And I can't say that I'm like, it's hard to, you want to be focused on the things that are like in your purview, like literally like in your city or your municipality or your county or whatever, your congressional district. You want to have an eye on those things. But there is a certain pressure to like sort of be aware of the totality of any situation. And with this whole like under the umbrella, I suppose, of police brutality and Black Lives Matter and things like that, I don't know, it's dizzying the number of things that I mean, people in general, I guess, are expecting of themselves and expecting of others to be on just on top of, and like we're trying to it's like trying to have instantaneous education about these these uh these conditions and these movements that are decades or centuries in the making. Like police abolition, which is something that is a movement and an argument that has been around for decades, essentially. Not that I've ever been an expert, and of course, we're all, like myself, we're all learning different things in this time. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of just I don't know, just a general reflection on the subject. And I guess I don't know. I don't think I can go over all these like 20 uh defund or abolish. What do people actually want? Is this a psyop? How do you prevent co-opting? This what is substantive versus symbolic? Um, how much do we just let the private sector address inequalities versus what can we do through the state? What is the role of labor and workers in this situation? What is the role of police in a capitalist economy? Like, why do we have police? Why is there this police brutality? What are they? What are they actually protecting? I can't answer all these questions myself in the next hour or so. Um, and again, it's really not my goal, I guess, right now is to answer any questions. There are plenty of people out there, intellectuals and public thinkers and organizers and just people, through their own lived experiences who are speaking on the subject. I'm taking it in. I guess really is just like, this is for me. I'm just working out everything that's been on my head. Before I went dark, I was working on my own little Medium post. I was compiling together references. I had like 30 references, like 50 references of like specific acts of like police escalation on protesters. Whether they're beating their asses or shooting them with bullets or rubber bullets or gassing them with tear gas or whatever. Um, uh, but I mean, so much has happened since then, and like I guess one thing I can stress is like, I think discussion and education is good. Like I've been looking back to like say Fred Hampton, who was the chair of the Chicago Black Panther Party. He was essentially assassinated by the FBI and the Chicago Police Department at the age of 21. But he was like, by all accounts, he was a fantastic leader and a really great thinker. And there's this one example of him when they're having some like a meeting, and they're talking about I don't know, some like infrastructure thing, and like we're gonna build this like a bank or something like that, and he's like he kind of goes on this tirade about like education. Well, like what's the educative part of it? What's the and give examples of like different successful like revolutions, but like if there's no if we don't have our head on straight about what we actually want, we can get things done. And like I can't from where I am, I can't tell anyone who's out in the streets or people are actually mobilizing and actually getting their representatives to notice them and mobilizing their communities and things like that. I can't tell those people to pump the brakes. But I do think I am on the side of, that it is important that we are as educated as possible when we come into these situations. And for example, I'll point out, in Minneapolis, they burned the precinct down, and then the city council was like, all right, maybe we have to get rid of our police department as it is, which sounds like, just like a win, but it could really mean anything. People have pointed out different ways in which it could, you could have it worse than, what it is. They could just hire private security, or they could just use state or federal police and, not really change anything. Or any number of ways in which, it's either worse or basically the same. And they're speaking as if they're committed to listening to the community and that they're going to take the time to figure out what will actually work for them. But if you're in that situation, and if you're in a position where you're like a community leader, or you're trying to make a collective decision as a community, if you have no historical background, you have no sense of the the structure in your community and the needs of your community, and the context of your city and stuff like that, like how do you know what to ask for, and how are you going to make your arguments to your representatives? In some way, like people out in the streets gives an opportunity, because politicians, you could write letters and stuff like that, and I'm sure based on the size and the individual politician that you're contacting, that may have some effect on how they respond. But like for the most part, this has been a discussion for how long? I mean, like even just in the context of like Black Lives Matter, what was it been like 6 years? And how many examples, how many prolific examples? I mean, there's certainly more than just the ones that we talk about. But how many prolific examples are there of just just the small example, just a very specific example of black people being killed by the police? And this issue is broader than that. Obviously, this is it's not to say that we shouldn't be specific about the conditions that create this environment, but I think the whole discussion, and I think it would be fairly uncontroversial to say that this is something broader to this issue. There's a reason that you have all these people out in the streets, because I think even if it's just viscerally, even if people can't articulate, I really think that there's some understanding of all these hundreds of thousands, maybe millions or whatever, people who are out there demonstrating. There is some understanding of the greater context. But again, I think that's why it's important that we have some understanding of the greater context around us, so that when we create these opportunities, when people are out in the streets and they're making their voices heard, whatever means that they accomplish that through, then when it comes to having that seat at the table or whatever, then what you need to say. But again, people sitting around talking and doing Zoom meetings and stuff like that, like if it never goes beyond that, even if you come up with a perfect solution, that doesn't do anything for anybody. Like in terms of like leftist like thinking and intellectuals and political idealists or whatever, there hasn't been this kind of opportunity. I don't know, when has there been this kind of opportunity? You can talk about like the Bernie Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020, of which, for me, that's kind of what helped me connect the dots on a lot of things. I wouldn't have considered myself necessarily political or too greatly informed, or, just being where I am, most people are like vaguely liberal in California, other than certain parts. But the vague liberal doesn't amount to too much that often. But I guess just understanding the bigger context, and then putting all those pieces together, and then taken to the point, like then at that point for me, then it becomes actionable, I guess. But that presented an opportunity to sort of, and I talked about it a little bit in, I did a stream after Bernie suspended the campaign about, there's really like an opportunity for the like the Democratic establishment to sort of actually, like, this was our compromise, like the demands of the base that have for the past few decades outpaced what the actual Democratic Party has been about. We've seen majority of people, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, supporting a single payer healthcare system, and other like public goods and redistributive like programs and things like that, where for the Democratic Party themselves, which are ostensibly like the left party in America, at least as it is structurally, not necessarily like, if you were to analyze it, to call them a leftist party would be a joke. But as it stands in America, like being a left party or like a de facto workers party, like they've been totally out of step with their base. At least if you look at it, those specific issues. Obviously, individuals are generally fairly like, they're not political in the same way that myself or other like nerds might be. It's a little less, it's more about like their experiences and their associations and things like that, and maybe what they get from media, versus like this like thing that constructed, and part of their identity or whatever. But the opportunity for us in that campaign was to sort of like get through changes that we needed with electoralism to start heading in the direction that our country needs to address like these different failures of our state, which manifest in some of the things we see now: police violence, poverty, and failure of our government to address a pandemic, which I'll get to hopefully. That's one of the big things that I think is super important to the current moment. But I mean, like that was like the opportunity on the electoral side, and I mean, obviously we have smaller ones, more local politics, state legislature and Senate and Congress and things like that. But obviously a national campaign has more, visibility, and possibly gives more momentum to the movement than a smaller race. But in terms of like these kind of actions, like we've seen people on the streets, Ferguson and Baltimore and other cities around the country. The Rodney King riots were like right before I was born. That's probably like, I don't know, the last time we've seen something kind of like this. But I mean, this is, even I understand, not having lived through, like specifically through all these other things, like that this moment, there's something different about this moment, because you don't just see it in Minneapolis, you don't just see it in New York or whatever. Literally across the country, not just urban areas and rural areas, people have this combative relationship to law enforcement all over the country. And, it tends to affect, yes, based on race, if you're black or brown or indigenous. But there's also the class element to it. Poverty and policing often are going hand in hand. But why is this moment different? I mean, one, the example that we had, the catalyzing example, and I don't know, people online like to browbeat each other and guilt each other into things. And I think, it works for some people. I think to some degree that's sort of how a lot of my ideas formed when I was younger, online, sort of being harassed into thinking certain things. And I mean, like, at this point, that doesn't work too well on me. Sometimes it's just annoying. So when people are like, why are you talking about this guy when there's this and this and this? I mean, like, I don't know. Who knows? I think there's a lot of different things, but I mean, a lot of reasons why this specific instance, it was George Floyd and those cops in Minneapolis. Perhaps it's because the example is so undeniable and how like brutal and disgusting it is, and like just inarguably undefensible, or just the perfect storm of like media attention. I mean, there's so many different things, and I mean, people like guilting other people like, why aren't you talking about so and so and so and so and so and so? Sometimes there's not a clear video or some other thing, or maybe we're talking about this other thing, or maybe people are okay with letting this be this umbrella of like, we're going under the umbrella of this one thing because we can all understand it, we can all agree on it, and as long as we're all working towards a similar goal. I mean, I understand. I mean, I guess it's the same as how I say like education is important. Educating yourself on the historical context and the law and things like that is the same as humanizing these victims of state violence, whether it be like directly at the hands of police or something else. And and I think there's been some that has helped gain some ground. I've seen, I guess, the change of the past 5, 10 years. I mean, always it always happens, right? When a black person is killed by the police, immediately after there's always some kind of like mug shot or be like, this person is no angel. They had this and that going on in their lives, in an attempt to defame them. So, them being killed by the cops seems not as bad. But I think the push for people to like, say their name and things like that. I mean, it's a small cultural victory, but I think to some degree, like changing attitudes is a sort of important part of the equation. I mean, I'll go back to Dr. King. You know, what was it? Was it? I know I'm getting mixed up. Was it? It wasn't him. I think this is a totally different quote, but they're kind of similar. Where it's like, if somebody wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If they can, then it's my problem, or something like that. But I think it was somebody else. But he said something about like, um, a law may not stop someone from wanting to lynch me, but it can protect me from that man being able to do it or whatever. Um, so I mean, yes, hearts and minds are important, but there's other like more concrete battles that give a little more ground. But I will say, and all that is to say just that I think there are some small victories to be won in that department, in the sort of the cultural one. But certainly we can't just be satisfied with the cultural victory. Um, but anyway, let me get back to my first point. Why is this situation different? Does it have to do with the catalyzing incident? Possibly. But I do think that this has all sort of been incensed and sort of like uh, it's been sort of what do you call it? I guess the ante has been up. No, not no. The fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, a lot of people without work, um, a lot of people are fed up with, having to stay at home. They're fed up that the government cannot or will not address their needs, whether it be, uh, governments opening up businesses too early, not providing people the resources that they need so they can stay home safely, not enough of a healthcare infrastructure that enough people can be taken care of, not enough of healthcare infrastructure so that people can be tested and take preventative measures, not enough resources so that people can have, protective equipment and masks and stuff like that, either their workplaces or whether they're healthcare workers or otherwise. I think it's just a general sense that, and I mean, this is sort of the same thing that's communicated in these poor communities where like the government does not care about you and you're kind of worthless and expendable and in fact perhaps even a nuisance. I think the same thing is essentially communicated. To me, when I hear essential worker, that is, another kind of state violence, basically saying that you're worth less than, a point on a graph, and that your sacrifice for your life is worth, I don't know, basically, if I was in that situation, and I can say that, I'm lucky enough that I'm not, but I mean, if I was, we're at a grocery store, working minimum wage, getting yelled at by people that don't want to wear masks, my government is not doing anything for me, I'd be like, wow, I don't fucking matter, do I? And I think that's sort of a collective feeling that I guess a lot of marginalized communities kind of feel like that under quote unquote normal circumstances, and now now the pandemic increases that feeling and exacerbates it in those communities, and now expands that feeling to other communities. So I think there's just this just underlying frustration uh, and sentiment that that not enough is being done, and that just all this sort of perfect storm of things coming together that makes this level of response happen in a country where this kind of response usually doesn't. And I mean, I guess I could have said at the top, but I mean, like, if you're one of those people out there, putting their bodies on the line, and trying to contribute to this in whatever small way you can. I mean, like, hopefully you can stay as safe as possible, both from literal like physical violence from whether it be law enforcement or random right wing vigilantes, or whether it's the virus or something like that. From what I've seen, people pointed this out. For the most part, I've seen lots of people out there on the streets, wearing masks, things like that, which is nice because you see people at like, beaches and restaurants and casinos and stuff like that, walking around, no mask and things like that. A lot less consideration for the people around them and the gravity of the situation than people who are, risking themselves to contribute to something and to make a point. So I appreciate all of you and try to be as safe as possible. I think I don't know, I think we're in sort of the perfect storm of like governments opening up businesses and people getting sick and tired of isolating and going out and protesting, and like even if they're wearing masks, I mean a lot of these cops aren't, and obviously they're arresting a lot of people, and I'm sure they're not caring too much about keeping people distant from each other. I mean, I don't know how much any of you as individuals have been following the police response to these protests, but it's been wild. Like incredibly, like, I guess in a way, like if we're looking at if we have this strong critique of the police, I guess it's not inherently surprising, I guess, but at the same time, it's like it has to be disturbing. I mean, like just how undemocratic and how brutal some of the things that you can see. That's just the stuff that was filmed and posted online. There are plenty more examples, I'm sure, that weren't cataloged in that way. But yeah, I mean, this is just a really unique and specific circumstance. I mean, some people pointed out that, it's not just the fact that like, people are out of work and like the government's not taking care of them. It's also the fact that like when you're not working and you don't have all these other things like wearing you down and eating up your time, like, maybe you have time to reflect on these things and if you have the energy and the time to actually go out and hit the streets or whatever. But I mean, I'm sure, this is a moment in time that will be dissected for years to come, unless this is just like, maybe we're just on this trajectory. Maybe we've gotten on the tracks, on the railroad tracks or the minecart tracks, and it's just gonna keep going. Maybe we're expecting like, people are gonna come out. This is gonna be this big thing, and it's gonna kind of dissipate. We'll kind of go back to being like, we'll win some symbolic concessions. All these cities will paint Black Lives Matter on a main street, and every Democratic politician will be required to wear, the Africa colors at all times. And every time a police officer kills somebody, they have to shout, "I acknowledge my racial privilege," or something like that. And then we'll just kind of be okay with that. And then, we'll just wait till the next time that people will become so fed up, and their material conditions become so bad that, like, they don't feel like they have anything to lose by putting themselves out there and putting their bodies on the line and things like that. Or maybe this is just like never gonna stop. it's just going to continue to spiral, because our representatives and those in positions of power just have no response to uh, people's actual conditions, and people realize that nothing's going to get done, and so they just don't stop. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure it'll be more of like a ups and downs, but I don't know. Is this something where we've crossed a line that we can't go back from? Is this something where like the only way to go is forward? I have no idea. Again, I guess I'm just asking a bunch of questions. I really don't know. Why don't I go through? There are a couple points that I wanted to touch, other than just sort of this meandering that I've been doing. I don't know if I'm gonna. I don't know. Again, I don't think I don't necessarily have the capacity to like talk about these kind of things every day, in any kind of meaningful, insightful way. I'd just be kind of rambling, and I'd run out of things to say pretty quickly because I don't have the depth, you know. But I have had a lot on my mind, and that's why I'm just kind of like working it out here. I mean, well, the one thing before, a couple weeks ago, where the situation was a little bit different, and I had a little bit, slightly in a different perspective, was, there was this distinction between like the peaceful protesters and the violent, opportunistic criminals and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that was, I don't know. It seems like the right narrative to push forward. It seems like a righteous thing to be like, well, I understand that people are angry, but they can't burn things and steal stuff or whatever. But I mean, I don't know. That's I don't know. That's pretty unhelpful. I mean, not like, if you're sitting at home, I don't know how great it is to like cheerlead people who are like, smashing windows and stuff like that. Like, if that makes you feel better. I mean, but at the same time, if you're in the same boat where you're sitting at home and you're like, I can't believe people are doing this, they should stop. I mean, I think those people should shut up too. Obviously we can talk about in terms of strategy, like what's the best thing to do, but at the same time, like if you're not there and if you're not experiencing these things, you can't really tell these people, what's what. And you can't deny that the efficacy of things, like if there was nothing on fire, if there were no windows smashed, like no news media would be talking about this. Even if there were fucking million people out in the street in like Minneapolis or whatever, like that would get like a day of coverage, maybe like an hour of coverage. And then that could happen every day for a year. And then, even right now, like news is starting to go on and they want to talk about other shit. Even though every day we're seeing tens of thousands of people still out there. And this is still an ongoing discussion because it's not as exciting or scary or whatever unless there is, property destruction. And I frankly, a lot of people seem to care more about property destruction than like permanent injury and death, and I don't know if that's any person who might be watching. There's about like 2 people watching, but I mean, that's certainly something to examine. But I mean, really, what I always saw that as, I say always, but I mean, what I saw that as in that moment, and it really scared me, and we saw the outcome of that. That line of thinking is just legitimizing the escalation of force by police, the bringing in of military and things like that. Like, some people being like, well, I agree with what they're protesting about, but they don't have to like steal stuff. So maybe the military should come in and I'll feel more safe. And then that line being perpetuated by pundits and things like that. I mean, that's super, 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 super dangerous. And I mean, like, it was bad and it could have gone much worse. I mean, again, the situation is still ongoing. Not that narrative can't still continue to be weaponized in order to, um, quash what little democracy we have in this country. Um, and I mean, people wanted to now the response, like, yeah, in a lot of places, cops have stepped down a little bit. And I don't know, people talk about like psyops and shit like that, like psychological operations, which is like, it's not even like a conspiracy theory. That's something like the military does. When these cops are out there dancing and kneeling with protesters and being like, I hear you, I see you, blah blah blah, and the next day they're kicking everyone's asses and stuff like that again. I mean, this is literally those are military tactics that they're using. They're trying to disarm their enemy through psychological warfare, essentially. So, don't fall for that shit. And now people are like, look at how peaceful we're being. To me, I don't know if this is particularly insightful, but to me, like, if you're talking about like Dr. King, he talked about non-violence, not peaceful. There's a reason people say no justice, no peace. Not because they're gonna go around and like kill people and steal and loot and burn, but because they're gonna get in your way and they're gonna be loud and obstructive. And the only way to get those in power to actually take notice and to actually make concessions is if you do something that inconveniences them. It makes them look bad and hurts the economy or whatever. There's a real clear distinction to me between peaceful, i.e. ignorable. You can't protest on the street. You can't kneel down when the national anthem is playing. Politicians said that they're gonna fix it, so just go home. If you want to protest, do it in your closet quietly, not after 10 p.m. and shit like that. That's what people mean by peaceful. That's what they want. They want something that they can ignore and they don't have to acknowledge. The difference between peaceful and nonviolent. You can be nonviolent, and be very, very not peaceful, very obstructive. Civil disobedience, right? Getting in the way, doing things that mean like, getting arrested and shit like that. And the fun example was when it was LAPD or something like that, or they had that like open call-in discussion, that like Zoom meeting where people just called in and roasted them. If you haven't seen this, look it up. I think it's like LAPD, like public something. I think there's like a compilation on YouTube. It's probably like LAPD getting roasted or something. Callers demand LAPD chief resign on public Zoom call. Los Angeles Police Commissioner meets in wake of LA residents speak outrage. Yeah, I mean, I just literally looked it up. LAPD roasted Zoom. There's some legendary owns on there, and I mean, I don't know exactly how like effective that is. Honestly, all those motherfuckers probably just had their calls muted while people were yelling at them anyway. But it is funny. And I mean, I think if it's something that like gives people like some energy and excitement, like if it fuels to people to continue, like that's only a good thing. But God, lost my train of thought. What are they talking about? Oh yeah. Peaceful versus nonviolent. Yeah, I mean those people are not being particularly peaceful. I mean they're just yelling at them on a phone call. I mean, I don't know if any of you guys have ever phone banked before, but I mean like, I hate talking to people on the phone anyway, and then having people yell at you when you're trying to talk about, how do you feel about this issue? And they're like, fuck you, you're a piece of shit. That's a violence to my soul, but it's not really violent. So yeah, don't buy that shit. Don't buy into the psyop shit. Don't play their game. Um, I mean, don't fall for the optics bullshit either, and the co-opting. I mean, the stuff with the Pelosi and them like wearing the kente cloth and kneeling and shit, like that's super obvious, but like cops kneeling and dancing and stuff like that, that's a little bit more cloaked. Or the stuff with like random like influencers and actors like suddenly becoming activists and wanting to have discussions with police, like maybe they're plants, maybe they're just opportunists, who knows, but like it's not going to be solved with a conversation. That's sorry, we can't. This is not a kumbaya moment with the state. Maybe within our communities, there can be some sort of like sense of communal healing or whatever. Maybe that could be productive. But you're not going to have that with, your representatives and cops and shit like that. Sorry. So all this stuff that they're doing to try and cow people and tame them and stuff like that, please just see through that. Recognize that the bullshit in that. Take a look at what else I got here. Oh, I guess the big discussion. I mean, one question I hear: what do people actually want? I think honestly, the answer to that is probably as what do people want? As many things as there are people out there saying they might want something. The issue with these mass movements, and I've seen people talk about like, what's the difference between now and say the civil rights movement in the 1960s? I mean, one, the material conditions are totally different. We live in a different time. And there's just so many different things. There's so many things about our world that are different. Economically, politically, etc. One thing I've seen pointed out is like there was a sort of like centrality to the 1960s movement. We had these clear leaders: Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Huey Newton, and so on. Clear leaders, activists, organizers, intellectuals, or whatever. I guess they weren't really. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the people who are intellectuals now were kind of like part of all that back then, at least on the left or whatever. But it seemed a little more centralized around these organizations, around these leaders. And I guess it's been pointed out, what is the pros and cons, there's a more clarity of vision when there's a clear organization, when there's clear leaders. But you may not be necessarily as mobile and as spontaneous as, a group of people who just show up on the street spontaneously without any real like hierarchy or organizational structure, like vertical organizational structure. Versus, like today, I guess the one question that has been for me is like, can we utilize the moment if it's totally decentralized and there isn't this clear demands that are being made? I mean, we saw quickly how easy it is for the movement to be co-opted, with the 8 can't wait shit and like the really, really, really basic reforms proposed in that, most of which like most police departments already do anyway. And they still kill people, and the criminal justice system is still stacked against communities of color. And with the bill that the Democrats proposed, which is kind of the same thing, like some things like getting military equipment out of police departments, that's good. Doing more implicit bias training, that's probably good. Banning certain things, it's probably good. But I mean, that's not really going to solve the issue, because it is police, but there's also more than police. Obviously, like, it's hard to have this discussion when it's like this huge thing that is spontaneous and there's millions of people, and it's hard to, like, I think, politicians, they can't be so dumb that they can't understand that, like, these issues are connected. I don't think Pelosi, I was about to say Joe Biden. I don't know what Joe Biden understands these days. I don't know where his head's at. I don't know if he's all there. I think that's fair to say, honestly. But like Pelosi, like, I don't think she's like an idiot. I think she understands that there is some correlation between poverty and police brutality, and historical segregation and blah blah blah. I mean, I don't know if she sees like the connection of all those things, but I think she understands. She has to have some understanding that these things are connected, and it's not just a one-dimensional issue. It's a multifaceted issue that runs through all the threads of our society and our economic system, and has a clear historical context. I think she understands that. But what politicians are not going to outpace their base, at least in terms of Democrats. I think the biggest material difference between Republicans and Democrats is the parties, because they're not really that different politically. But Republicans, they get bullied by the most extreme of their base. They run to the right of their moderates. Democrats, they whip their base in line. If you're a Democrat, you gotta vote blue no matter who. You gotta fall in line. You gotta listen to, the party demands, and you can't ask for too much, because they can't do it. They're not gonna do it. Whatever. So basically, like, if it's not being asked for in enough of a clear way, then they're gonna do the co-opting stuff. They're gonna do the bare minimum. And they're gonna call it a day. They're gonna fucking kneel. I mean, come on. They're again, I also talked about this on that stream after Bernie suspended the campaign. Like, yes, these institutions have power over your lives, and electoral politics is a way to engage with things that have control over your life. But you can't rely on these institutions to look out for you and to provide for you and to solve these things, because they're not going to, because the structure of it is what the issue is. They're not going to delegitimize themselves. Democrats aren't going to, after decades of saying, we can't solve X, Y, and Z problems, they're not going to be like, oh, because of the pandemic, we're going to pay everybody, we're going to give people houses, we're going to give people health care, we're going to do all this shit that we said we couldn't do, but now we're just going to do it, and we're going to invalidate everything we said about why we can't do it, So in this moment, they're not going to change the strategies. Maybe they're sweating a little bit, and so they're going to do this symbolic shit now. They're going to wear the fucking Africa colors, they're going to paint the fucking murals, but they're not going to do anything too substantive unless the pressure is really on them. So I mean, I guess that's why people are having these arguments about, like, are we talking about reform? Are we talking about defunding? Are we talking about abolition? And I guess in that case, it's important to have a clear demand and a clear argument or whatever. But I guess it's only as effective as what it's able to accomplish. I guess if we're talking about, like, what do I think? I mean, again, I'm not someone who is, like, part of the historic abolitionist movement. I mean, I've read some things about that in the past, and it all sounds chill to me. Like, I agree, like, we have to really, really take a serious look at, what you might call the prison industrial complex, or, modern slavery in America, the evolution of slavery in America. I've had recommended to me, the documentary 13th on Netflix, which talks about uh, essentially. I mean, so my education came from Killer Mike on the Reagan track from his album Rap Music. Um, I can't remember the line. It's like free labor is the cornerstone of U.S. economics. Uh, Voluntary slavery and servitude prohibited in the 13th Amendment. Unless unless you're in prison, blah blah blah. I mean, I think that was my introduction to that. Basically the 13th Amendment. Slavery, no more, unless you're a prisoner, and obviously that plays out in what we see in like Jim Crow, and I mean up to the modern day of the crime bill of '92 and mass incarceration that we see today. America having the largest prison population in the world, not even per capita, just sheer numbers. We're certainly not the most populous state in the world. But in terms of abolition, addressing that our criminal justice system is part of the racist legacy of slavery in this country, and is also fuel for our economic system. I mean, this country was built on free labor, i.e., slavery, and it continues to do so, whether it's in prisons, in its borders, or abroad. So in terms of abolition, addressing that, I'm obviously I'm with it. As someone, who frames their political thinking around essentially a critique of capitalism, and a sort of like, I don't know, I guess people say intersectional. Of course, I'm gonna be on board for addressing those aspects of it, and rethinking policing, and the need for what we call police. But then there's sort of like this discussion of like, well, abolition is not doesn't track with the majority of people, which is fair. So what should our demands be in the moment that can be accomplished with the current effort? And so there's the talk of defund, and I think that's a lot easier that's pretty easy to sell. I mean, Los Angeles, for example, one of the largest economies in the world. It's just just a city in America. 54%, I believe it was, of the city budget goes to the LAPD. That's like billions of dollars. And the city has a whole host of issues, of failures, especially in terms of housing, failures to its community. And there's all this money going to the police department. The simple argument for defunding is we don't need, the guy with the gun to come in and tell people to not smoke marijuana in front of the store. We don't need them to give you a ticket. We don't need them to do wellness checks. We don't need them in schools and things like that. These can be discreetly handled by people who are trained professionally to handle those specific cases. Maybe it's important to have like some of that apparatus. If there's serious crimes, people want to be safe, they want their property to be protected, they don't want to get hurt or whatever. Some of that apparatus may be necessary in those situations. Obviously, we can't solve the issues of our economic system overnight. And the issue of policing is only part of what makes the whole thing work. So even if you get rid of the cops, you don't solve everything. So we understand that like there are things that our community needs. It needs education. It needs healthcare. We need people to be housed. we can take the money and allocate it in those different areas. We can reduce the number of people going around armed, capable and ready to use deadly force in any situation. Save that for, if it's absolutely necessary for whatever the circumstances, and put our resources into addressing problems in more productive ways versus just killing people or beating them up or whatever, or otherwise terrorizing them. And I mean that's an argument that is gaining traction in terms of public favorability. Although of course reading polling is always it's sort of dubious. It's very difficult to it's inadvisable to base everything off of a few polls. But I mean it is something that you can say is gaining traction. I mean, if we're trying to be specific about this context, I mean, that's sort of like the least we can do, honestly. But I don't know. I would say like we can speculate, and we could have these discussions, and we could try to educate each other. But anyone who's like trying to be like a soothsayer, or is going to be like, this is what's going to happen, this is probably what's going to happen, just run the other way. Those people, nobody has any fucking idea what's going to happen. Nobody. Whether it be electorally or just generally how this is all going to shake out. Nobody knows. Maybe we can say this might happen or that might happen, or this happened in history in a similar context, but there really is no context like what there is now. There really is no group of people, no coalition. Nobody has any clue. I mean, even other things that were supposedly, that I would say are more predictable, say like, who was going to win the presidency in 2016? What was going to happen in the Democratic primaries in 2020? Things that seem a lot more predictable than what we're looking at right now. People had no clue what was going to happen. They thought they did, but they didn't. And the same goes for now. But we can still try to be strategic, I guess. I mean, like, I'm not like talking, and I'm not like an organizer. I'm not like talking to anybody. I'm not like giving anybody helpful advice for what they can do. I mean, I don't know, if you're sitting around, you don't know what to do. I mean, getting educated is a good first step. But if that's all you do, that's basically as worthless as if you didn't know anything. Maybe you could say you're saving your knowledge for when the time is right. I mean, I guess we didn't predict that this opportunity would be here now. But it is here now, and there are things that we can do. Whether it be, going the streets, doing that as safely as you possibly can. Donating, yeah, that helps. Doesn't necessarily like fortify the cause. It just kind of like addresses, specific things, like whether it's like posting bail for protesters being arrested, or providing funds for illegal things, or people who get injured, or things like that. Which is, it's not bad to support those things. It's just like, it's not necessarily something that fortifies a movement. You can do things like have conversations, things like that. I think we've seen like a pretty dramatic shift in public opinion overnight. People who are generally scolds about like being too mean on the internet are out there defending like, actual property damage. And I don't know if it's just because like people only care about things when they affect them, and if somebody's store is being robbed like a few states over, you don't give a shit. But if someone is mean to you online, then suddenly it's the gravest offense in the world. I don't know, but I think there's been a genuine shift in the way people are thinking about the sort of umbrella of topics that are in the air at the moment. But I don't know. Sometimes it's, you can't change people's minds. You can only help them change their own minds. Uh, but I mean, you can try to engage in that as much as you think is useful. Uh, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure things out. I'm just asking questions. Um, I guess one other thing I could bring up is talking about symbolic and basically BS. Um, I mean, there are things that are symbolic that aren't necessarily like, that you can be like, hey, that's cool. I think people like tearing down like Confederate statues and like statues of Christopher Columbus and things like that, and doing vandalism. Honestly, like that is there's something a little bit more powerful about that. I think the difference between people in a city tearing down the statue of a slave owner uh, and a city mayor saying we're gonna paint Black Lives Matter on a street. It's sort of like the difference between like a graffiti artist painting a mural on a building in a city that they feel totally alienated in. They feel like that people in power don't care about them, and they have no like real promise. There's no promise, no opportunity given to them, and then they just feel totally let down by the world around them. Reclaiming some part of this space, making it their own. You know, communicating, letting their voice be heard in this instance, versus like a brand changing their logo to the pride colors for a month. You know what I mean? Like both of those things are sort of symbolic. I mean, one of those things is purely symbolic, but the other there is something. I mean, it's kind of material because you're affecting the space around you, but it's a symbolic in a way that's sort of like I don't know about revolutionary, but there's something like liberating about it, right? Tearing down a racist monument or reclaiming this alienating space around you that has nothing to offer you, but making it yours in some small way. There is something. It's symbolic, but like in a cool way. You know. So I don't know. That's a distinction we can make too. Symbolic in a lame bullshit way, and symbolic in a cool way. Symbolic in a way that actually might reflect changing attitudes. Because we had this discussion like, should we keep Confederate statues and shit? And then people are just gonna say no. They're just deciding that as communities, like no. But then again, you have like the fucking alt-right vigilantes, bootlickers out there armed, with ARs and stuff, defending, statues for some reason. And I was having a discussion. I guess I was almost saying America is sort of almost analogous to like, say like our ventures in the Middle East, where it's been like there's this leader or this leading party that we don't like, and then there's this rebel group that doesn't like them, and so we give arms and training to that rebel group to overthrow the leader in that area. And then that just creates this situation where there were a dozen distinct groups that had these very different histories and were all in contention to each other in some way, and we didn't understand the conditions in that area, and we created this chaos and this violence and in this situation because we didn't understand it, and it was just trying to create opportunities for ourselves in the region. And it's almost the same way. Like there's such a fracturing in American society that's just held together by the fact that like even though there's this massive wealth inequality and this huge disparity between people at the top and people at the bottom, there is a degree of comfort that a lot of us enjoy. Like even if you're fucking broke, even if you live in fucking projects or whatever, your house might have a TV, you know? Even though you might be scared every day of like violence or losing any sense of security that you might have a smartphone, you know? There might just be enough luxury, enough of something that we feel like we don't want to lose or whatever, that keeps us from, going at each other or whatever. But I mean, there's enough of these weird fractures in our society, these insane bootlicking vigilantes, weird libertarians, anarchists, and communists, and random libs and stuff like that. Like, there is, we have a two-party system, but there is so much in between and around and beyond that two-party system that we think of politically, that, like, I don't know, if there's something about like the social fabric that becomes undone, I don't know. It might unravel in a way that's totally unpredictable. And so for me, it was like, maybe it's a good thing that police departments, as they are being demoralized and they're quitting and stuff like that, and hopefully they're demilitarized and disarmed on a large scale, because they've shown that they are not beholden to their citizens. They're not in service to their communities. They're more akin to an invading force. And they are the invading force of this country brought home to roost. I mean, look at the Matt Christman had the whole talking about the historical context of what fascism actually is, and the definition of like the imperial colonial forces being turned inward on its own citizens versus, instead of just expanding outward. And you could see that in Police in America. So, I mean, I don't think they will be sympathetic to most people. They're not going to be on the, as much as there are good guys and bad guys, which is a stupid way of looking at most things. They're probably not going to be on a great side. I'll say that. As we've seen. So if it ever gets that bad, we don't want them to be as powerful as they are. There may still be some hope for the military. I don't know. The U.S. military is has its own interesting character. It's not going to be the same as in other countries where, the CIA has done a number of coups, or, facilitated a number of coups in Latin America. We've had some recent examples, attempts in Venezuela, success in Brazil, success in Bolivia. And it may not have come out yet. I mean, the Venezuela one was pretty blatant. I mean, there's an obvious U.S. connection. Brazil and Bolivia, it's not as obvious yet, but I'm sure in 10 years we'll learn that it was, it had something to do with our deep state. But I mean, like, a lot of times it's like, a charismatic military leader overthrowing a political leader who is unpopular with some sort of like bourgeois, or I don't know, or aristocrat class or something like that. Like the military overthrowing a leader and then beginning to represent the interests of companies or some sort of, ruling class in that country. But our military culture is very different. It's about as alienated as everything else in our country. There is a sense of centrality to it, and this sense of like you're almost like there's like a disconnect between what your organization is doing and what you as an individual are doing, to where it's very easy to just kind of like just following orders. You know, it's very easy to do that, um, because you know they're going to be so distant, um, between what they're doing as individuals and what the effect of the organization that they're part of. Um, and I mean, you see that play out abroad, but I mean, I guess it'd be very different to see. We've seen examples of that, you know, with the National Guard being called out on protesters. Um, I mean, hearteningly, you know, a lot of those people were very uncomfortable in those situations. Frighteningly, you know, they allow themselves to be put in that situation, and you know, but and they're I mean, David McAdie, I guess at this point is conclusive. He was killed by being fired on by someone in the Guard. I forget what state that was in. But you know, that's a little less conclusive. I think police in this country, as they are, if it went, you know, went to shit, that would be like an easy, like they're not gonna be they're not gonna be on your side. I guess depending on who you are. If you're some like rich like business owner or whatever, you know, maybe you know, that association will still hold true in that situation, and that would still benefit you. But I mean, like, in terms of the military, it's less easy to say. And I mean, the people at the top on the military are more bureaucrats than tacticians, you know. So they probably just stay loyal to the bureaucracy, if anything. They're like mostly void of ideology, other than, you know, the overall ideology of their branch or whatever. But I mean, that's just I mean, all that's pretty abstract thinking, I guess. This is just sort of like speculation, which is not really useful. But I mean, that's just something I was thinking about. Yeah, I could talk about this forever. I don't know. Usually the streams haven't been going that long. They've been going like an hour and a half, maybe. So again, this stream is not really like I'm gonna solve an issue. I can't fucking do that. This is just me like wondering what's gonna happen. What should we be thinking about? What are the things that what's at play? What's bullshit and what is not as bullshit? Kind of in a way addressed a lot of these things that I have in my notes. Oh yeah, the private sector. I'm sure everyone's been seeing, you know, brand A, B, C, D, E, F, G being like, we understand that racism is a thing and we think it's bad and we're committed to saying that racism is bad. You know, maybe they donate to something or whatever. You see a lot of wealthy individuals and companies donating to Black Lives Matter, which is like an actual like foundation or organization, I guess, but it's like a little dubious, like what they actually do. Like Black Lives Matter is a hashtag, it's a slogan, and that's generally what people are talking about. Most people aren't necessarily talking about like some sort of national Black Lives Matter organization, because that appears to be a thing, and it's really unclear what they actually do. So donating to that, you know, may not solve anything. And I mean, like, Jeff Bezos can donate the entirety of his wealth and to, like, I don't know, the NAACP, and that's not going to solve the problem, you know. But I mean, the thing that we should be more not be in any way satiated by is these kind of things. I mean, like I don't know if maybe you guys are following this sort of like situation at Bon Appetit. I love watching cooking stuff on YouTube, and I've watched a lot of Bon Appetit. It's fun, but you know, they're old. Their former editor in chief. He did some like brown face like racist costume or whatever for Halloween. Um, and so that came out, and he was getting in heat for that. And then people started coming out, like Sola and others, like telling their stories about how, you know, people of color were treated as, you know, second class in that company. And now like the whole brand is coming out and saying like, here's the things we're gonna do to address, you know, racism in our company and stuff like that, which is cool, I guess. If that actually comes to fruition and actually like improves the lives of people who have been, you know, marginalized in that specific scenario. And I mean, I guess not to say that we can't celebrate even narrow victory, but I mean, I feel like just because we engage with everything as consumers and we really only feel empowered in any way as individual consumers, you know, like, I don't like this brand, so I'm not going to buy something from them, or I have something of theirs, so I'm going to burn it or whatever. Like, that seems to be like the most powerful thing that we can do as individuals, because we're so powerless in our society. We're so alienated from anything in our world and anything that we do, that it's only ever a consumer choice. So it follows that, like, you know, only brands can save us, you know. That's pretty sad. And I mean, I don't think people should be really feel in any way encouraged by brands having to say that they support Black Lives Matter, because they're only doing it to protect their financial interests. So I mean, if we can't rely on brands, if we can't rely on politicians, I mean, the changes that we want are going to have to be manifested through these institutions. But I guess we also have to recognize that a brand saying that Black Lives Matter, or that politicians wearing Africa colors and kneeling, recognizing that that's not really doing anything, even if there's money involved. It's not just the fact that it's money, you know. It's a systemic thing. It has to do with our economic system and the things that drive that. But we do need to, unless we can somehow create our own institutional power outside of traditional institutions, like entirely, like create like a nation unto itself with, you know, in that addresses all its situations in a way. I mean, you have the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, and there's been all kinds of discussions around that. And, you know, maybe that'll turn out to be like a cool thing and actually helpful, but who knows? It's a developing situation. But I mean, like, unless we're going to do that, we're just going to create our own government or something like that, we have to use these institutions, going to the state or whatever, or your workplace. That's where change is going to have to happen. But it's not going to be with this symbolic top-down kind of thing. And I mean, you know, as someone who, you know, I guess may identify like as a socialist or whatever, or is looking at things like through like a Marxist lens or whatever, even though I'm not, you know, I'm not particularly like, I'm not like a theory buff or anything like that. I'm not super well read. Um, but I think it's fair enough to say that my perspective, my analysis is kind of in that framing, um, and to where the democratization of a workplace is an essential part of what I think is necessary to address these issues and to come up with a system beyond the current capitalist economic system. But that's different. When you have like workers and unions doing work stoppages in solidarity, like the longshoremen, I think that was the other week, they were gonna go on strike. Or like in Minneapolis, those bus drivers who are like, we're not gonna bus people to jail, we're not gonna bus cops out to these protests. That kind of like worker solidarity, that's good. Like, if workers can actually, as workers, create the conditions of equality in their workspaces and have a say in what their workplaces actually do, that's good. But a spokesperson for a multi-billion-dollar company being like, we're kind of racist sometimes, so we're gonna try not to be. That's nothing. Politicians, offering these meager reforms, that's not really anything. But we do have to sort of go through these institutions to really get anything done. So I mean, I guess it's a situation where it has to be looked at with a certain amount of nuance, but not so much that you're thinking about so hard till you turn blue or whatever, and not actually get anything done. Because that's not any better than just having symbolic victories. But I mean, I guess just understanding, like, if we want to keep up the momentum, like, be heartened by things like these small victories, like your Supreme Court victory. You can think that it's cool when people tear down statues and stuff like that. You can think that it's cool that public opinions are changing. And the people are donating to these causes and people are on the street. But definitely do not be like, oh, they wore the kente cloth, our job here is done. Oh, Disney said that Black Lives Matter, so our work here is done. That's nothing. Don't let them co-opt. Don't let them get away with just symbolic stuff. Continue to press demands. I mean, just be able to see through the BS. Try not to engage into things that are too what do you call it? Things that are too counterproductive, basically. I guess it's as much as I can say at the moment. Wish I could shout out. Like, I've been trying to look at something that's more local to me and something more specific that, like, is like, yeah, I might criticize like the instinct to just donate and then just kind of be like, well, I did my part. But it certainly can be helpful in critical moments. And I mean, even if it's just like an individual, like helping an individual out, that's not a bad thing. But I was hoping to look at something that was sort of specific and something a little bit underserved at the moment. But I couldn't find anything. So I don't know. I'll keep looking into that. Again, this channel will sort of resume business as usual for the most part. But yeah, I think that's about all I have for now. I don't know if there was any kind of through line to what I was talking about. I didn't expect to be totally coherent today. I was just like, I've been like anxious. I've been like waking up in the middle of the night. That only happened to me once. Just waking up, just like all these things in my mind. I've been like, going on social media. I don't want to say it's useless, but I mean, like, it's only so helpful. But there's been this sort of feeling of like being compelled to like take in everything that's happening all at once and trying to know as much as possible. And I don't know if that does anything, but I mean, being able to articulate some of what I'm thinking about and just sort of, I don't know, work some of this out. Again, it's mostly for me. I don't know if it's going to help any one of you guys watching, but I appreciate if you have been. And this is not like, I gain nothing from this, like financially. I'm not building my brand or whatever. I'm just doing this because it's something to do. But yeah, I'll try to continue. I don't know what streams are going to look like in the future. Like, it's always just been whatever I think of, you know. But we'll see about continuing other kinds of regular content or whatever. I'm like other people where I'm just like, I don't know. I was working all this stuff like just a couple weeks ago. Everything around me was kind of crazy, but I kind of felt good about what I was doing in the moment. And now I just feel like totally thrown off. But we'll see. I'll find a way like to adapt without, adopting complacency. That is always an issue. Like, there's this self-help thing where like, you have to manage your stress and your anxiety. And really the only way you can do that fully is to like just kind of ignore the awful things that transpire around us and sort of the horrible injustice and brutality of the system that we all take place in. So finding a way to sort of like have a healthy understanding of all of that while still being able to like live my life, but also like not being totally like just tuned out, or apathetic or whatever. I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to have a balance with all that, but I mean, I think there are probably better and worse ways to deal with it. So I'll continue to try to figure that out. Maybe we'll have some discussions about that. But hopefully you guys are, again, staying safe, looking after yourself and each other. And streams again will continue. So I don't know what's going to happen on Thursday, but I will see everybody on